Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International podcast. I'm your host, CEO Dan Mariaschin. Stay tuned for my interview with best-selling author Bruce Henderson about his brand new book, Bridge to the Sun, the secret role of the Japanese Americans who fought in the Pacific in World War II, and his 2017 New York Times bestseller, Sons and Soldiers, which highlights the epic, previously untold story of the Ritchie Boys. Just one brief reminder before we delve into our conversation, check out our series Conversations with B'nai B'rith and all of our interviews on Facebook and YouTube. You'll find discussions with diplomats, historians, Holocaust survivors, Middle East experts, even the first Jewish American male astronaut in space. And get our latest content by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook at B'nai B'rith International. Well, following Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. military was desperate to find Americans who spoke Japanese to serve in the Pacific. Who did they turn to? The Nisei, or second-generation Americans of Japanese descent, whose parents had immigrated to America from Japan in the early 20th century. Eager to prove their loyalty to the United States, several thousand Nisei, many bravely volunteering from the internment camps where they were being held behind barbed wire, were chosen by the Army for top-secret training and then rushed to the Pacific Theater. There, these Japanese American soldiers became highly valued translators and interrogators. In his new book, Bridge to the Sun, The Secret Role of the Japanese Americans Who Fought in the Pacific in World War II, author Bruce Henderson captures this unforgettable story of patriotism through the eyes of 6 Japanese American U.S. soldiers who helped save countless American lives, even as their families were being imprisoned in the internment camps back home. Henderson is also the author of the 2017 book, Sons and Soldiers, the untold story of the Jews who escaped the Nazis and returned with the U.S. Army to fight Hitler, which tells the incredible story of the Ritchie Boys. Jewish families sent their young sons away from danger to safety in America, knowing they might never meet again. When these young men came of age, they became American soldiers determined to return to Europe to fight for their adopted homeland and for the families they had left behind. Astonishingly, post-war Army report found that more than 60% of the credible intelligence gathered in Europe came from the Ritchie Boys. Author and military historian Bruce Henderson has written more than 20 nonfiction books, including Sons and Soldiers, the #1 New York Times bestseller that was made into a highly rated television miniseries. A former newspaper reporter, magazine editor, private investigator, and field producer for television news, Bruce is a member of the Authors Guild and has taught reporting and writing courses at Stanford University and the USC School of Journalism. Bruce, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
Well, let's talk about your new book, Bridge to the Sun, Secret Role of the Japanese Americans Who Fought in the Pacific in World War II. You tell some harrowing stories about the courageous Japanese American soldiers who fought Japan during World War II. What went into finding these details? What was the research process? And why did you decide to tell this important narrative through 6 of these soldiers?
Well, the research, in fact, of interest, I think, was when I was working on the book about the Ritchie Boys, Sons and Soldiers, back at the archives, and digging into those files and coming up with names of Ritchie Boys who were still alive, who I could go out and interview. I came across the fact that there were several thousand Japanese American soldiers who were trained at a different military camp in World War II, but the same kind of training that the Ritchie Boys had, which was only in the Japanese language for the Pacific. And they were trained as interpreters and translators and interrogators. And I knew about the Japanese Americans who were sent to Europe, infantrymen who fought there in the 442nd Combat Unit, one of the most decorated units of the war. But I did not know that there were several thousand of these Nisei, American-born ethnic Japanese, who were sent into the Pacific. And I had written already several books on the war and in fact on the Pacific War and didn't know that. So I made a note at that point that when I was finished with the Ritchie Boys, I would come back and take a look at the Nisei. And that is what I did after Sons and Soldiers came out and became a bestseller. And then I went back and I looked at the Nisei, and I've really come to think of these two stories as bookends. There are a lot of similarities, strong parallels between the Nisei and the Ritchie Boys. Both were trained in secret for identical missions in opposite theaters of war, and each endured prejudice and overcame distrust to become among the greatest assets of the U.S. military in that war, because they knew the language, the culture, and the customs of our enemies. In the case of the Ritchie Boys, it was the Nazis, the Germans, from which they had escaped as young boys, and for the Nisei, about the culture, history, and language of our enemy in the Pacific, Japan. So I delved into the same kind of research for the second book, Bridge to the Sun, at the archives, and trying to locate veterans who I could go out and interview.
Well, tell us about the Japanese American men in your book and where they fought. Now, they were really asked to do a little bit of everything: translate, to fight, to obtain military intelligence. A bit about their profiles, and how did you select the 6?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's a really good question, and it comes down to a couple of very important qualifications, if you will. One is that I wanted to get coverage of the war. The war in the Pacific was, of course, a very big canvas, and I didn't want, say, all of the fellows who I'm focusing on to be in the same place at the same time. I wanted, one of them at least to have been at Iwo Jima, another in Burma fighting with Merle's Marauders, another in Okinawa, and I really wanted to show how they were used theater-wise. So that was part of it, where they served. And also, well, a bit of realism here is I needed either to have them alive, that I could go out and interview them. And unfortunately, not surprisingly, our veterans of World War II are becoming few and far between. I mean, at best, they're in their late 90s, and they're getting, harder to find. And so if they weren't alive for me to interview, I needed to have a record of earlier interviews that they had given, oral histories, perhaps private memoir that they had written, some kind of material that would allow me to enter their lives, what they were thinking and feeling, not just where they were at and where they were fighting, but the interiority, if you will, of their characters. So that very much went into the selection of the 6 who we followed throughout the war, and I followed an equal number of Ritchie Boys and Sons and Soldiers, and I found that was a format that really worked. Interestingly, in the case of the Ritchie Boys, 4 of the 6 that I chose were alive at the time that I did my research, and in fact, 2 of them are still alive. Amazing guys, 99 and 100. And of the 6 Nisei who I focused on, only 1 was still alive. And I had an interview with him, but honestly, he had lost a lot of his memory. And I met him, obviously, for the honor of sitting there with him. But if it hadn't been for the oral histories he'd done earlier, when he was still fresh, his memories were still fresh, I wouldn't have been able to include him. And then all the others came from these oral histories and private correspondence. I reached out to all the families, anything that your father, your grandfather left in the way of diaries, letters, any private memoirs, published or unpublished, any interviews. A lot of them had given interviews to local veterans associations, and able to get a hold of those. So the research itself, Dan, took about a year, maybe a year and a half. And then I started writing. So then that was another year.
What about families? I've seen over the years various documentaries on different aspects of World War II, and for those who fought, who were not here, or maybe were not able to give those interviews. Oftentimes, there'll be an interview with a son or a daughter, a family member who may have heard many of these stories firsthand. Did you speak with the families as well?
Oh, yes, I did. I did that. And of course, from my perspective, I would rather get it first person, which would be either, in an interview or them, the actual veteran giving an oral history. But no, the families are an important part of the research. Although I must say that when my book came out, Sons and Soldiers, I had a number of families contact me and say, when you sat down with my dad for those 2 and 3 days that you were here interviewing him, he told you stuff he'd never told us. And we learned more about dad or granddad from the book than we did from him when he was still alive. And I found that the case also with Anise. And there were vets and are vets of war who it's not real comfortable reliving some of those experiences. And from World War II, a lot of the fellows, came back, didn't want to think about the war, got a job, went to school, raised families, and often, didn't share those kind of details until many years later. What was sort of the impetus for a lot of them was when they started having reunions, like the 101st Airborne Division, for example, having its association reunion, and then they'd get together with their old buddies and start talking. And a lot of those groups began sitting them down and doing oral histories. So by then, though, that was already 30 years after the war. So I thought that was interesting.
Now, the opening chapters, Bridge to the Sun, are devoted to the early years of these young men. What were the similarities, do you think, between their personal stories? They were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. Did it differ in any way, or were they largely the same, let's say, as other immigrant groups who came to this country?
Okay, well, the other thing that went into selecting those 6 that I followed throughout the war in Bridge to the Sun is they were all what are known as Kibe, and that would be that was a Nisei, or first generation Japanese American, whose immigrant parents sent usually their eldest son back to their ancestral homeland, Japan, in the 1930s for a couple of years of schooling, to meet the relatives, to get to know the culture and language of Japan, and then they returned, and Kibe means returning, to the United States. Well, when war broke out, you can imagine when the U.S. Army decided that we needed, people who could understand and read and write Japanese. There was a presumption initially that any Japanese American knew Japanese, but that was not the case. A lot of the Nisei who had never left, say, California, went to school, at the local high school. They were, there was nothing really Japanese about them other than their ethnicity, right? They didn't necessarily know the language and couldn't really be taught how to be fluent in it in 6 months, which is what the Army needed. So the Army looked for these Kibe who had gone over to Japan and had either gone to high school or even in some cases a year or two of college in Japan, and returned with those kinds of skills and fluency. And they were the most valuable to the Army as interrogators, translators. So all of the 6 that I profiled were the Kibe. And I also thought that was interesting to bring in their view, if you will, of Japan back in the 30s, and of the people. And that's kind of where I got the title from, Bridge to the Sun, because in a way they were, even though America was their homeland, Japan was their parents' homeland, and they honored their parents by having spent time there, and so there was a connection to this, if you will, this enemy country. But I thought that was also a very interesting part of who I selected and why I selected them.
Where did the Army send these Japanese American men for this top secret training to become the translators, interrogators, et cetera? And
Yeah.
how do you think that the training that they had prepared them for what they did after the war ended?
Oh, well, that second part of that question is interesting. And I don't know if I've been asked that before, but the camp where they were trained at was in Minnesota. And initially the Army had a Japanese language school in San Francisco, but in fact, that started up just before the war started. But then after the war, they had to move this school inland because of they didn't want any Japanese, even Japanese Americans on the West Coast. And that was, part of the roundup and the relocation and all that. So even the Army school had to move inland. So they went to Minnesota. It was called Camp Savage, and they trained about 6,000 of these Japanese Americans, and then they sent them out when they were after 6 months. And again, the most of them, not all of them, but most of them went into that school fluent in Japanese, and what they had to learn was a lot of the military stuff. What's the term for this kind of maneuver? What's the term for this kind of equipment? And that kind of stuff was primarily what they were being taught at that camp. When they graduated, they formed 10-man intelligence teams and were sent overseas. And these small teams were attached to larger units, either from battalions to regiments to Army headquarters, and to give all of those levels of the Army from the field, from the battlefield up and beyond, that kind of language capability. And of course, when it came to interrogating prisoners of war, they had to be where they were captured, close to where they were captured, which was close to the battle lines. That's the best time to interrogate an enemy prisoner, to get information. They're the most that could potentially be the most valuable for our forces. And the other thing, of course, about the Nisei that I loved and spent a lot of time on is Okinawa was it was called the last invasion, and it was probably the last big battle of the war, and it was the civilian casualties were horrific. They would have been even more so if it hadn't been for these Japanese language teams, our guys in there talking to civilians, hundreds at times in a cave, that were ready to go in and blow themselves up because they had been really brainwashed by the Japanese Army that, if they were captured by Americans, they would be brutally tortured, and that wasn't a life that they wanted, and it was better if they ended their lives. And there were actual mothers holding their babies, jumping off cliffs. And our guys were getting to as many of them as they could. And in fact, I saw some statistics that after the war, they were credited with, our language teams were credited with saving upwards of 100,000 civilian lives just by cave after cave after cave, getting these civilians to not kill themselves. So that was a huge part.
And the training for the post-war part of their lives?
Well, now, Dan, I'm not sure if the training that they had for the war, which again was a lot of the military terminology, I'm not sure how much of that went into what they did after the war or the success. I mean, all of these guys just came home like other vets. A lot of them became farmers because their parents were farmers, or they got civil service jobs with their veterans credits. And so I'm not sure that when you're in military intelligence, what you're learning specifically can be translated necessarily to business or after war success. I don't know if that's true.
Something I think is on everyone's mind concerning the Nisei, whose families were forcibly and relocated to internment camps in the Western United States. How did these soldiers fighting for the United States reconcile their service with the internment of their parents and their siblings under those conditions out in the western part of the country. We talk about this unthinkable juxtaposition at such a consequential moment in history. What kinds of observations did those that you included in the book convey just about that particular part of their lives?
Well, that was just over their heads and filling their hearts all the time. I mean, several of the guys that I profile were in fact recruited by the Army out of a relocation camp. And so the irony of it, you can imagine, they are in this camp with their family because they aren't to be trusted. And now here comes the Army saying, oh, we need you. We need you to volunteer for this special military intelligence school. Well, enough of them did. And most of them, of course, were really, frankly, happy to prove their patriotism as Americans, and were glad because initially they had been, the Army had stopped drafting Japanese Americans early in 1942. They just didn't want them in the Army. Well, suddenly they've decided, no, we actually need these guys. Not everybody, though, in those internment camps felt that way. And there was bitterness, as you might imagine, and in fact, the volunteers in one of the camps, one of my guys ended up telling this story when he volunteered in the camp and was actually with 10 other young men given the oath, to join the Army. They took them out in the middle of the night by the back gate because they didn't want to drive them through the camp and have any possible demonstration or repercussions against their families for these guys volunteering what some people call the spy school. And so, there were those elements, and there were demonstrations in some of these camps. So these guys, here they are now in the Army going to war against, their ancestral homeland at the same time that their families are being held behind barbed wire. They're fighting in essence, they're fighting two wars, which is the way I put it.
So now they're in the Army. What kind of discrimination did they encounter? I mean, despite their major contributions that they were making, that they were about to make as they got in the Army and then made as the war progressed, did they encounter discrimination of any kind?
Yeah, and that was a question I asked all of them, and their answers for the most part were the same, and also a bit of a surprise. They said they did not experience personal, individual prejudice in the Army. However, the way the Army considered them so valuable, these 10-man Japanese language teams, that they would take them out and put them in front of the battalion or the regiment or the division. And these guys might all be, for example, from Texas, or, some of these Army units were National Guard units that came from the Midwest and maybe had never even seen a Nisei before. And they were introduced, and they said, okay, these guys, first of all, are Americans. They're not Japanese. They were born in America. They're as American as you guys, and they're going to be really valuable out there. And they're going to not only help us, win some battles, but they're going to help save American lives. So treat them well. Well, and they pretty well got that kind of welcoming them from the GIs. And in fact, when they would land, Iwo Jima, for example, they would actually have their own security teams that would be with them to make sure that they weren't, didn't become victims, for example, of friendly fire. But it was never a case that they felt threatened they were going to be shot consciously by a fellow GI. But in the case of Iwo Jima, word went out that Japanese soldiers were taking the uniforms off dead Marines and dressing in them and infiltrating the lines. And now suddenly we have a Japanese American interpreter who is in a Marine uniform, but he's a good guy. So, they wanted to be sure that none of them were were accidentally killed. Some of them were, and I did tell the story of one in particular who was killed by accidentally returning from a mission, and he was mistaken for an enemy soldier.
Well, the role of these men in saving lives on both sides really is nothing short of extraordinary. Can you talk about Takajiro Higa, who he was and what he did for the citizens of Okinawa?
Yeah, and he was Okinawan himself. Both his parents were Okinawan, and he was even though he was born in Hawaii, he was taken to Okinawa at a very young age 2, and stayed there until he was into his teens when he returned to Hawaii. So he knew Japanese and also the Okinawan dialect from having been raised there. And he, when war broke out, he volunteered for military intelligence and went off to Camp Savage to be trained. And when he graduated, he joined the 96th Infantry Division at New Guinea, and he was in this 10-man headquarters intelligence team. And they went from New Guinea to the Philippines shortly after MacArthur had landed there, and they were already planning this invasion of Okinawa. And word got out that they had on this language team an Okinawan, and who had this great knowledge of the geography and the people and all of that. So he was called into the general's headquarters, and which was a bit, as you can imagine, well, he thought he was in trouble when he was called in. But it turns out that they put in front of him these maps, large wall maps of Okinawa, and started getting briefings from him on what to expect there. So he ended up working for about a month with the planners of the Okinawa invasion beforehand, and looking at aerial pictures that had been taken, providing intelligence. And then when the invasion happened, he was in one of the early units that landed on Okinawa, and almost immediately he began not only interrogating prisoners, but importantly, going from cave to cave to talk these civilians out of their their plans to kill themselves. And I end the book with him 50 years after the war, when he returns, as a man in his 70s to Okinawa, and an article in the local paper is done on him, and somebody reaches out to the newspaper and wants to meet him. And the next day, this meeting is held, and it's a woman who was in one of the caves and remembers him saying, "I am Okinawan. I am an Okinawan boy. I am here." And she thanked him for her life, for helping, for convincing her to walk out of the cave. And she had with her her daughter, young adult daughter. And she also thanked him, because if you hadn't saved my mother, I wouldn't be here. And so that was, such a moving end, I thought, of this book about the war in the Pacific, was going back to the fact that these guys saved lives.
Oh, what a great story. What do you hope readers will take away from Bridge to the Sun? How does the story add to the larger story of World War II?
Yeah, well, the takeaway for me, on this story is that I feel that there's really never been a better time for this book to be published, and I think we are living in a country here in America that unfortunately still too often prejudges people based on race and ethnicity and countries of origin. And I think the timeless message of these young Japanese American soldiers of courage and patriotism really should never be forgotten. And they were sorely needed at a really difficult time for our country, and they stepped forward. And there are I think others like them that are that are out there, and that we need to honor them.
Well, let's talk about the other book, the other bookend, as you said, Sons and Soldiers: The Untold Story of Jews Who Escaped the Nazis and Returned with the U.S. Army to Fight Hitler, about the Ritchie Boys. How did the Ritchie Boys earn their name, and what did they learn? How did what they did compared to what the Japanese Americans, their fellow soldiers, were doing on the other side of the world?
Yeah, the Ritchie Boys were trained at a place called Camp Ritchie, which is, even though they weren't really during the war called the Ritchie Boys, they became known as that after the war. Camp Ritchie was a training area for, mostly German language, but they also had other fellows in there learning other languages, because there were other countries in Europe, obviously, that were occupied by the Germans, and needed to be certain language skills there. But also there were about 10 or 12,000 of them trained in at Camp Ritchie, and about 4,000 of them were German-speaking Jewish immigrants. And the reason, I think that, they were so valuable was, again, just like the Kibe, who had spent some time in Japan, these fellows, for the most part, were born in Germany or Austria, and got out in the 30s, usually through the effort of Jewish relief organizations, and in many cases were not able to get out with their own families, but were boys or very young men. And then when the war broke out, because they were German speaking, there was also this kind of immediate distrust that they sounded German, and we were fighting the Germans. But the fact that they were Jewish, there was a pretty big motivation for them, obviously, to want to join the fight against Hitler. And the army figured that out pretty early on, that we should bring them in and train them and put them in these language teams. And it was very, very similar to what was done with the Nisei when they graduated from Camp Ritchie, where, again, they were taught different military terminology and how to interrogate prisoners, and what you could say and what you couldn't say to a prisoner of war, that kind of thing. They were put in 10 and 12-man intelligence teams and assigned to all of the combat units that were getting ready to go into Europe after D-Day. They were taught different interrogation techniques, for example. There were different superior knowledge, for example, is where you overwhelm a prisoner with details that you already know about enemy units, and therefore they sort of open up and think, well, if they know that much, what harm is it to tell them about this? And so there's also a form of bribery where you use a chocolate bar and or light up a cigarette in front of them and say, oh, you'll be happy to share this with them if we could just have a conversation. Find common interests, they were told, so that if a prisoner, say, for example, is a soccer fan, the interrogator would talk soccer to the prisoner and have him forget that, the interrogator wore a different uniform. Last but not least, use of fear, in which the interrogator learned a prisoner's anxieties and fears. For example, one threat that they would use: if you're not going to talk to me, then we're going to turn you over to the Russians. Well, there was nobody in the German army, in Hitler's army, that wanted to be turned over to the Russians. So often that got a lot of them thinking. One thing they were told, though, was there was no such thing as what later became known as enhanced interrogations. They were taught not to lay a hand on the prisoners. And these Jewish guys certainly had every reason in the world to slap a arrogant SS officer, and they came across them, quite often, but they didn't, and they felt that not all of these enemy prisoners opened up and gave them information, but whatever information they got had to be voluntary, because if you torture, not only is it wrong morally, but if you get information out of somebody because you're hurting them, they'll tell you anything to get you to stop hurting them. So the whole thing of these enhanced interrogations, which the United States did for many, many years after, is just wrong and doesn't result in the best intelligence. So those are the kinds of training that they got.
When you think about it, and you just talked about it, but to think that some of these folks came over here, they were 15, 16 years old, more or less. They were teenagers.
Right.
I came over from Germany, escaping a terrible fate, and within a year or two, right, they were in uniform, going back to the same place. I had a professor as an undergraduate who came out of Augsburg. He was a teenager, and then went into the army and then went back. So many stories, thousands, as you've said. And I think it's really what a turn of history that these individuals would have the opportunity to both escape and then to go back to serve their new country, the country that had given them this haven, and to be able to help to defeat the enemy.
There was an added motivation for most of these guys too. When I talked to them, they said most of them had lost contact with the families they left behind, and they had no idea what had happened to them. And so many of these guys told me, I went over there hoping that I could find out where my family is, and where they were, and to and that was part of their motivation. And at the same time, these guys became part of the liberating forces that went into the concentration camps, and not knowing if they would find their mother, their sister there alive or dead. And it just was a horrendous kind of thought and weight that they must have carried with them through the war.
Did all of the Ritchie Boys survive the war?
Oh, no, they did not all survive the war. In fact, in my book, we were able to find about something along the line of 60 of them that died in combat. Interestingly enough, the Army never produced a roster of Ritchie Boys, and we had to put that together one soldier at a time back at the archives, and it was just a multi-year project. Same with the Nisei for Bridge to the Sun. In fact, in both of my books, the last 30 or 35 pages is a complete roster of, well, in the case of Sons and Soldiers, 2,000 German-born Ritchie Boys, and are listed there. And I can't tell you how many families have reached out to me since that book has been published. And my father, my grandfather, my uncle is in the back of your book, and I had any more information on him, or I had no idea that he was a Ritchie Boy. And I really wanted to make that record, and I must say it was very important to me to run those rosters and identify those individuals.
Many of the Ritchie Boys went on to assume many positions of power and influence, including Ambassador Richard Shifter, whom I know you interviewed for the book, who became a diplomat in addition to being a leading attorney in Washington, D.C., and a tireless fighter for Israel and the Jewish people. What is their legacy, Bruce, both as soldiers and after the war, with all of these guys who went on to really succeed in so many different fields?
Well, why did so many of them succeed in so many different fields? I'm not sure I've gotten totally to the answer on that, except I keep kind of shaking my head and going, back in the 30s and early 40s, these guys, what a bunch of smart young men these fellows were. And, that camp, I understand, Camp Ritchie, there were, it would be more like on a university campus, because from the walk to the barracks to the cafeteria, you might hear 6 or 7 different languages being spoken. The conversations in the barracks often were more like what you would hear in a college political science course than in an army barracks. So these were there was a degree of intelligence and worldliness. Again, they had been born over, in Europe and been educated there. And then they came to this country, but they were all these really, the Army picked them well for their missions because they're not only bright, but unbelievably motivated. They did not have to be, the average GI, if you don't do this, then we're going to have you, go do the garbage detail. Well, nobody had to say that to the Ritchie Boys because they were motivated to do their job, to get over there, to defeat the Nazis, to see Hitler fall, and to reunite with their families. Now, did they all succeed in doing that? No. Many of them, their families were killed in the gas chambers. And as were Dick Shifter's parents, as I recall. And so, but their motivation was that. And nobody had to sit them down and tell them what their job was.
Well, you've called them bookends, but they're much more than bookends. Both of your books cover largely untold stories of courage and fortitude during World War II and the Holocaust. There certainly are, and there's connective tissue here between the two books and the two stories. Bridge to the Sun: The Secret Role of the Japanese Americans Who Fought in the Pacific in World War II by Bruce Henderson is now out, and it's available wherever you purchase books. Bruce, you have so beautifully captured some of the most important stories of World War II, and we're so glad you could speak with us about Bridge to the Sun, one of the last great untold stories of that war. Thank you for joining us today, and best of luck to you.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, if you're looking for more of our programming, visit our website, benebrith.org, to listen to all of our conversations, podcasts, and live interviews. Thank you again to best-selling author Bruce Henderson for delving into his books Bridge to the Sun and Sons and Soldiers with us today. And thank you for listening in. If you like what you hear and you're in a podcast app already, tap the subscribe button to follow us. You can also listen to the show via the B'nai B'rith website. For my guest, Bruce Henderson, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm your host, Dan Mariaschin. Talk to you again soon.